In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the Holocaust, and this lecture is important because it'll provide you with a lot of the background and the context for your readings in Spiegelman's Maus. So let's start with how something like this could have happened. How could you get to the point of a nation exterminating 6 million people? Obviously, the numbers are going to be even higher than that because although typically when we refer to the Holocaust, we're referring to the Jewish Holocaust, there were millions more murdered by the Nazis as well for a variety of reasons that sort of contradicted the Nazi racial purity test. So, in terms of the Holocaust itself here, I want to kind of run through a couple of these iconic pictures so you get a sense of what they are. In the top corner, we'll kind of just go clockwise here. In the top left corner, this is the view of the train tracks, the entrance into Auschwitz, which was essentially one of the largest camps in Eastern Europe, where, in terms of your reading from Maus, this is where Volume 2 of Maus takes place, which is in Auschwitz, which is specifically designed as a death camp. You also see, just to the right of that, you see the standard sign entrance there. It says Arbeit macht frei. What that means is sort of literally is work will set you free. It is, of course, an ironic statement by the Nazis because most of the people who arrived at Auschwitz were exterminated. A certain percentage of them did end up doing forced labor, as you've read about, but for the most part, many of them are exterminated. So it's just one of the kind of bit of sick humor on the part of the Nazis for people entering. Uh, Below that, you see, upon liberation, you see piles and piles of corpses of emaciated prisoners that were found by the Allies as they liberated the camps in 1945. And then in the lower left corner there, you then see ovens of the crematoria. And so these were the ovens in places like Auschwitz where they would essentially run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, burning as many of the bodies as they could. And then sometimes they would use the ovens for this. Other times they would use open pits for the burnings, as we'll see. Obviously, it's a incredibly gruesome process, and we'll learn a little more about that as we move on. What this lecture is really aimed at doing is providing you, like I said, the context for how the Holocaust can occur. In order to do that, then we have to look at German society, Nazi society, in the early 1930s. And part of this was the way that the Nazis, in their sort of racial ideology, how they framed um, their worldview. And their worldview was, for the most part, predicated on a question. The question was, or the Jewish problem in this case, and their question was, what do we do about all the Jews? Remember that the Nazis are incredibly anti-Semitic. It's part and parcel of their platform. It's one of the key motivating factors in what brings them to power. You've seen that in Hitler's writings from Mein Kampf. The Jews become an easy scapegoat for the Nazis. They are alternately labeled as capitalists on the one hand, bleeding Germany dry. On the other hand, they're also labeled as communists, apparently exactly at the same time, which is obviously a flaw in Nazi ideology, but they wouldn't usually refer to them as both in the same sentences. Anyway, the progression of the Holocaust was the Nazis' answer to what they perceived as a Jewish problem. What do they do about all the Jews in Germany? Well, why is this going to be an issue? Well, in part of the context, um, as we've seen many times in the post-World War uh, period, there's all of these socioeconomic problems, particularly in Germany. They have very specific causes, but many people found a convenient scapegoat in the Jews. So people blamed these problems on the Jews. Yes, there were Jews who were part of international banking and had been for a long time, as well as many other groups. But they were seen as the cause of the Great Depression. I should say they were wrongly seen as the cause of the Great Depression. They were also then blamed. So on the one hand, they're blamed as being bankers. On the other hand, they're blamed as being the ones who were responsible for communist uprisings. The sort of rationale for that was simply to say, well, there are Jewish communist intellectuals, therefore communism is Jewish somehow. Trotsky, by the way, was a sort of a classic case that was used by the Germans. So that's one of the contexts. You have these turbulent economic times. People are looking for someone to blame, and Hitler and the Nazis immediately identify the Jews as the problem. And how and why they're able to do that has to do with the context of anti-Semitism and racism in Europe. Um, Religious anti-Semitism was not unique to this period, and it had been part of European culture for centuries. Uh, some of the earliest references to it in a concerted fashion began all the way back in the 11th century with the First Crusade. As Crusaders left medieval Europe to go, as they said, liberate the Holy Land from Muslims, they decided to stop along in towns and cities throughout Germany and massacre the Jewish populations there simply because they perceived them as enemies of Christianity. So the Nazis don't invent anti-Semitism, but they do sort of perfect it in the 20th century. So it had been part of European culture for centuries. In the late 19th century, with the rise of things like scientific racism and extreme nationalism, this issue became not just about religion, but about race. And Hitler then takes it even further. He idealized Germans as the descendants of a so-called Aryan race. You can see the term there under number 2. Uh, the origins of this of the term Aryan meant there was a group that was linguistically different from Semitic groups, but the Nazis are going to take this into even sort of further realms of absurdity. Uh, they thought, the Nazis and others thought that these Aryans had been responsible for the dawn of civilization in Mesopotamia, in India, in Europe. They believed that the greatest nations were homogenous and that they had all worked together to achieve greatness. Therefore, anyone who didn't fit that mold, non-Aryans, Jews, Gypsies, others, were considered, and Hitler in particular, considered them biologically inferior, even subhuman, and had to be excluded from society. Later, the solution wasn't just exclusion, but extermination. Now, in this sort of anti-Semitic and racial ideology of the Nazis, the Nazis, Hitler in particular, and the Nazis included what they considered otherwise unfit individuals. And so the ones who would fall into that category for them would have been homosexuals, physically or mentally handicapped, anyone with genetic disorders. All of them needed to be either concentrated in some area or simply removed from society or perhaps even exterminated. And so Hitler and the Nazis believed that the master race, this Aryan master race, needed room to live, and it was only just and proper for them to force others out of the way because they perceived themselves to be the strongest, and they picked up on that that sort of social Darwinism aspect of survival of the fittest, and applied that to their society. They simply were successful conquerors because of their genetic predisposition. Now, the form that this took was this idea of getting them all, in this case Jews or any other people they considered undesirable, getting them out of their territory ended up being a system best summarized by this term here, Judenrein. Judenrein literally means free of Jews. And their goal was to make Germany, and then Greater Germany after that, Judenrein, to make it Jewish, free of any sort of Jewish element at all, obviously the people. So there would be no remnants of the Jews there. So writings, synagogues, any areas that had been uniquely Jewish, and then of course the Jews themselves. And this was the goal, to make the Nazi-controlled territories completely free of Jews. So that's what Judenrein means there. And the way that this happened was in 3 stages. When Hitler and the Nazis come to power, it's not exactly anti-Semitism is absolutely part of their main platform. However, there's a lot of debate about whether or not, when they came to power, that they had in their minds a concept of the Holocaust in terms of an extermination. They obviously had the concept of Judenrein there, but the question was, and still is, and debated, whether or not they actually planned on extermination from the beginning, or it was something that became part of the process of Nazification and war. I think one of the things that sort of leads a lot of scholars to believe that that the idea of extermination wasn't necessarily firmly cemented in the Nazi mindset at the beginning, was that their approach to the Jewish problem began in stages. And so those stages are, prior to 1939 and the outbreak of war, a lot of the Nazis promoted the idea of emigration. So notice the E on the front, emigration. They wanted Jews to get out of the country. Not that they were necessarily exterminating them, they just simply, their thing is get out, make Germany Judenrein by getting rid of all the Jews. So they encouraged emigration. They, stamped passports and let people flee. And many, many Jewish families fled to all different parts of Europe. The only problem is, though, is that there was a lot of places that turned them away because they were coming in such mass numbers. The United States actually is one of those places because there's an infamous example of a ship full of Jewish refugees. The ship was known as the St. Louis, that was turned away by U.S. authorities and forced to return to Europe, whereupon most of the people who were on those ships ended up being exterminated. Stage two was the ghettoization of the Jews, and this occurred predominantly between 1939 and 1943. This is the process whereby they were consolidated into confined areas such as ghettos. We're going to talk about these in a little bit, but particularly in places that had been conquered by the Nazis, in places like Poland, for example, the Warsaw Ghetto is the main one that springs to mind, that the Nazis rounded up all the Jews in the city, and then even from outside the city as well, and then essentially forced them all into these very narrow, confined areas of town, and ultimately just walled them in. And created checkpoints. Everyone who was Jewish had to not only register but relocate there, even if they didn't live in that part of town. So that's stage two, is the ghettoization, the concentration of Jews in many of the cities. And then, obviously, the last part of that, the third stage, would be the utilization of camps, particularly beginning in 1941. 1941 is usually considered the beginning date of what's known as the final solution, the ultimate extermination, or the plan for the ultimate extermination of the Jews. And so that's the what you see in 1941 to 45. Notice that stages 2 and 3 don't line up exactly. You have a lot of overlap between them, but it still gives you a sense of sort of the progression of how the Nazis approached this. Now, how did they get society to go along with this? Well, one of the ways that they did this was to build upon anti-Semitic stereotypes, and they did that in part. We've seen the way that the Nazis utilized the Hitler Youth to promote their values at the very young age of Germans, but they also had these anti-Semitic school books here. Here's one called Gift Pilz. That's a poisonous mushroom. And you can see, by the way, and this is the cover of the book, you can see from the cover how stereotyped it is. Obviously you have a Star of David in the front that tells you that this mushroom and or person is Jewish, but then you have physical stereotypes, these sort of racist stereotypes of, in this case, you have the beard and you have a big nose, and then you've got all of these other sort of stereotypical Jewish figures around him as well. Of course, the idea is that the mushroom is poisonous, and that therefore the Jews, like the mushrooms, are deadly. And if you think that that was a little bit hard to interpret, then you can just simply go to one of the pages in the book where you have the Aryan family here with the young boy picking up mushrooms and handing them to his mother, who says, just as it is often hard to tell a toadstool, which is poisonous, from an edible mushroom, so too is it often very hard to recognize the Jew as a swindler and a criminal. So this is sort of the same thing, saying you need to watch out in the forest because you don't know exactly what you're picking up. Is this mushroom good? Is it bad? Because they all might look the same. And so that's part of what the Nazis were saying, is even though you may not be able to tell them apart, you need to find a way to separate the poison from the good, or in this case, the Jews from the Aryans, so that you can have a good society that doesn't have these so-called, according to the Nazis, criminals and swindlers.